Tommy had always lived his life in a world of constant motion. The rush of school, the endless chatter of his friends, the hum of the city that never seemed to stop. But on this particular day, something about the busy streets felt different. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the bustling crowds as he walked home from school, sandwich in hand. It was just another normal afternoon, until Tommy noticed her, a young girl, sitting on the cold sidewalk, her back pressed against the brick wall of an old building. Her clothes were ragged, torn at the edges, and her face was worn down with exhaustion. In front of her, a cardboard sign read, "Hungry, please help." Tommy paused, staring at her for a moment. She wasn't asking for much, just a little kindness in a world that didn't seem to care much for people like her. His heart twisted, and for a brief moment, he considered walking by. After all, everyone else was. The street was filled with people rushing past, too busy with their own lives to even spare her a glance. Tommy's grip tightened around the sandwich in his hand, as if he was suddenly unsure whether it was his to keep. He kept walking, but something nagged at him, pulling him back. Why couldn't he just help? His feet slowed, his mind raced. His eyes darted back to the girl sitting on the ground, and with a deep breath, he made a decision. Tommy turned around, his footsteps echoing louder than the city noise. The girl looked up, startled, as Tommy approached her, holding out the sandwich he had been clutching. She blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "You want to help me?" she asked, her voice soft, almost incredulous. Tommy nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, I thought you might need this." He handed it to her, watching as she took it with trembling hands. Her eyes flickered with something between disbelief and gratitude, but she didn't say anything more. She just clutched the sandwich tightly, looking at him as though he were some kind of strange, benevolent creature. They sat there in silence for a moment, the noise of the city around them fading away. Tommy felt something stir inside him, an unfamiliar feeling. He had never really seen people like her before, not up close, not in this way. It was as if the world around him had suddenly become clearer, more urgent. He had always known that there were people who lived on the margins of society, but he had never really seen them until now. As Tommy sat there, trying to figure out what to say next, a group of his friends walked by, their voices rising above the others. He recognized them instantly: Danny, Josh, and a few others from school. They stopped when they saw Tommy sitting with the girl, their laughter sharp and dismissive. Danny, ever the loudmouth, was the first to speak. "What's this, man? You're just hanging out with the homeless now?" Tommy felt his heart race as they gathered around, laughing and jeering. "What's wrong, Tommy? You finally figured out that you're a big-shot savior? Look at you, saving the world one sandwich at a time." The mockery was thick in the air, and Tommy's cheeks burned with embarrassment. But there was a moment, a small flicker of something deep inside him, that refused to back down. He looked up at his friends and said, "What's so funny about trying to help someone?" His voice was shaky, but the words felt strong. "Just because she's on the street doesn't make her less of a person." The group fell silent for a moment, the teasing still hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. Tommy stared back at them, defiant, as he picked up his backpack and stood. "I'm going to help her. You can laugh all you want." They shrugged and walked off, muttering under their breaths. But Tommy didn't care. He turned back to the girl, Maria. She had introduced herself as, and sat back down beside her. He wasn't sure what to say next, but something told him it didn't matter. The bond between them had already started to form, unspoken yet undeniable. Maria didn't speak for a while. She just looked at him, studying his face as if trying to figure him out. "You don't know me," she finally said, her voice quiet. "You don't know what it's like to be like this." Tommy felt a lump form in his throat. He couldn't understand what it was like, not fully. But the more he looked at her, the more he realized just how little he had ever really understood. The world was much bigger than his own small bubble, and Maria's eyes opened something inside him, something he didn't know he was missing. "I don't know," he said after a long pause. but I'm willing to listen." The conversation was awkward at first. Maria didn't share much, but enough for Tommy to understand that life had been cruel to her. She had no family, no support system, and had been living on the streets for longer than she cared to remember. People walked past her every day without a second glance. They ignored her, avoided her, and treated her as though she didn't exist at all. Tommy's heart broke a little more with every word she spoke. When it was time to go, Tommy stood up, unsure of what to do next. He didn't know how to fix things. How could he? But the feeling in his chest, the one that had started with that sandwich, didn't go away. In fact, it only grew stronger. "I'll come back tomorrow," Tommy said, his voice firm, more certain than he'd felt all day. Maria didn't smile, but she looked at him, her eyes softened by a kind of understanding. "I'll be here," she replied quietly. As Tommy walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that something bigger was unfolding, something far beyond his understanding. He couldn't know what the future held, but he was sure of one thing. He wouldn't just walk by the next time. The city hummed around him, and the streets were just as busy as they had been before. But Tommy's world had shifted in that brief moment. He had seen something, someone, that had been invisible to him before. And now, he couldn't turn away. As Tommy walked home the next day, the weight of his decision to help Maria felt heavier than he anticipated. The world around him seemed unchanged. People still hustled about, their lives unfolding in a blur. But for Tommy, everything had shifted. His feet dragged as if each step was taking him further from the world he knew, and closer to one he hadn't yet fully understood. He couldn't shake the image of Maria sitting alone on that sidewalk, looking up at him with those wide, uncertain eyes. He felt a sense of responsibility pressing down on him. Tommy arrived home to his usual routine, the same house, the same dinner table, and the same conversations. His parents had long since finished their workday and were now in the living room, talking about their day. Tommy could hear their voices coming from the other room, lighthearted and casual. He wondered if they had any idea what was going through his mind. "Tommy, are you coming in to eat?" His mom called out as he stood in the hallway, frozen by the weight of his thoughts. "Yeah, I'll be right there," Tommy replied. His voice lacked the usual enthusiasm, but he masked it with a forced smile. Dinner was a quiet affair. Tommy's parents, as usual, talked about their work, the neighbors, and their daily lives. But Tommy's mind was far away. It kept drifting back to Maria, the homeless girl he had met on the streets. He couldn't stop thinking about her, about how she had looked at him with such quiet desperation, yet still held herself with a sort of dignity. He wondered what her life had been like before the streets had swallowed her whole. The conversation at the dinner table shifted abruptly when his father, noticing Tommy's distraction, glanced up from his plate. "Tommy, is everything okay?" his father asked, his voice serious but not unkind. Tommy hesitated. Should he tell them about Maria? Would they understand? Would they care? He thought about how his dad always referred to homeless people as lazy or entitled, as if they were asking for something they didn't deserve. But this felt different. Maria wasn't just asking for help. She was simply trying to survive. "Yeah, I'm fine," Tommy replied quickly, trying to hide his unease behind a mouthful of mashed potatoes. He didn't want to get into it, not yet. His mom, noticing the tension in the air, spoke up in a more upbeat tone. "Have you talked to your friends today? It seems like you've been quiet." Tommy let out a deep sigh. His friends, the very people who, only yesterday, had mocked him for helping Maria. He thought about the jeering faces, the hurtful words. They had made him feel small, as though his decision to help was something to be ashamed of. They were just joking around," Tommy said, trying to downplay it. "You know how they are." His father, who was never one to beat around the bush, leaned forward, eyeing Tommy carefully. "Son, I don't want you to get caught up in all that nonsense. You've got to understand something. People like her, they've made bad choices. They end up where they are because they don't know how to take responsibility for themselves. It's not your job to fix them." Tommy's stomach twisted at the words. The very same words he had heard countless times before. But now they felt colder, near silent. He could feel his father's disappointment hanging in the air. His mother, sensing the growing tension, quickly changed the subject, but Tommy could hardly focus on anything they said after that. He finished his meal in silence, his mind far from the dinner table. Later that night, long after his parents had gone to bed, Tommy lay awake in his room, staring at the ceiling. He tried to push away the thoughts swirling in his head. Thoughts of Maria, thoughts of his father's disapproval, and the whispering doubts in his own mind. He had done something good, hadn't he? But was it enough? The next day, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Even at school, the weight of it all followed him. His friends gave him sideways glances when he walked past them, but no one spoke to him directly. It was clear they were still mocking him behind his back, and it hurt more than he expected. They didn't understand, and he didn't know how to make them understand. They were his friends, but the world they lived in seemed so far from the one he was starting to see. By the time the school day ended, Tommy was drained. He walked out of the school building, his heart heavy with the sting of rejection. But as he stepped into the bustling streets, he saw her again. Maria was sitting against the same brick wall, her sign resting in front of her. The moment Tommy saw her, something inside him clicked. He knew what he had to do. Tommy didn't hesitate. He walked straight toward her, cutting through the crowd of busy pedestrians, all of whom seemed too absorbed in their own lives to notice the girl on the sidewalk. He reached her and smiled, a real smile this time, not forced or uncertain, but genuine. "Hey," Tommy greeted her, his voice softer than before. "How are you doing today?" Maria looked up, startled at first, but then she gave him a small, cautious smile. "I'm okay. You came back." Tommy sat down beside her, taking a deep breath. "Yeah, I did. I promised I would." For a long moment, they simply sat in silence, the noise of the city swirling around them. Tommy wanted to ask about her life, about the things that had brought her here, but he didn't know where to start. Instead, he just asked about the small things, the weather, how she was feeling, and, most importantly, if there was anything he could do to help. Maria's voice was quiet but steady. "I don't ask for much. Just, sometimes, a little food helps. And maybe someone to talk to." Tommy nodded. The weight of her words hung in the air, heavier than he had expected. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that he wasn't about to turn away now. The city continued to rush around them, indifferent and cold. But in that moment, as Tommy sat with Maria, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't much, just a small flicker of connection, but it was enough. Enough to know that whatever happened next, he wouldn't turn his back on her, or anyone else in need. As the afternoon light began to fade, Tommy realized that the decision to help Maria wasn't just about her. It was about him too. It was about finding a way to stand against the world that told him not to care, and choosing instead to do what felt right, no matter the cost. And so, as the crowd rushed past them, Tommy made a promise, not just to Maria, but to himself. He would keep coming back. He would help. He wouldn't stop. The days that followed seemed to blur together for Tommy, each one passing with a weight that was both heavy and liberating. He found himself walking down the same busy streets, searching for Maria, hoping to find her sitting against the brick wall in her usual spot. Every time he saw her, something inside him tugged, reminding him that he had made a choice. One that would change everything, not just for Maria, but for him as well. It was early one morning, just before school, when Tommy found her again. As always, she was sitting on the sidewalk, her back against the weathered brick, her cardboard sign resting on the ground. But this time, something was different. There was a quiet desperation in the way she held herself. Her head was lowered, her eyes focused on the ground. Tommy's heart sank as he approached her, the air around him suddenly feeling thicker. "Maria?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked up slowly, her face pale, her eyes tired. There was something else there, something that made Tommy feel uneasy, a kind of resignation, as though she had given up on the world and everyone in it. "Hey," Tommy said, kneeling beside her. "Are you okay?" Maria hesitated for a moment, as though she was deciding how much to reveal. Finally, she spoke in a voice that cracked with vulnerability. "I'm tired, Tommy. I'm really tired." Tommy's chest tightened at her words. He had seen Maria struggle before. He knew she wasn't exactly living the life anyone should. But there was something in her eyes now that shook him to his core. She wasn't just tired from lack of sleep or food. She was tired of fighting. Tired of existing in a world that didn't seem to care if she lived or died. "I don't know what to do anymore," Maria admitted. Her voice so small that Tommy could hardly hear it. "I've been on the streets for so long, and every day it gets harder. I don't know how to change it. I don't even know if I can." Tommy felt a rush of guilt flood through him. He had promised to help her, but how could he? What did he know about this kind of life? How could he fix something so broken? He wanted to offer her something, anything. Something to make her believe that there was hope left in the world. But he had no answers. He had no solutions. "You don't have to do this alone," Tommy said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm here, Maria. I'll help you, whatever it takes." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as though she were trying to gauge if he really meant it. "I don't know if anyone can help me," she murmured, her voice filled with the quiet despair of someone who had been let down too many times. "Everyone just keeps walking by." Tommy sat down beside her, trying to think of something to say that could offer her the comfort she needed. He knew this was bigger than just him, bigger than just Maria. It was about a system that had failed, about a world where people like Maria were treated as invisible, as if they didn't matter at all. "I'm not going to let you be invisible," Tommy said firmly, though his own words felt like they were barely enough. He took a deep breath, his thoughts racing. "We'll find a way out of this. There has to be a shelter." Or, before he could finish, a voice interrupted them. "Hey, what are you doing with her?" Tommy spun around, his heart pounding. A group of teenagers had approached them, 5 or 6 of them, all boys, dressed in hoodies and jackets. Tommy recognized a few of them from school. One of them, a tall boy with a smirk on his face, stepped forward. His name was Mike, and he was known for being a bully. "What's this, huh? You're helping out the homeless now?" Mike asked, his tone mocking, his eyes scanning Tommy and Maria with disdain. Tommy stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. He wasn't afraid, but there was a knot in his stomach. He didn't want to make this any worse for Maria, but he couldn't just back down either. "I'm just talking to her," Tommy said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Is that a problem?" Mike laughed, the sound grating in Tommy's ears. "It's not the talking, man. It's the fact that you're wasting your time with someone like her." He gestured at Maria, who was now looking down at the ground, her shoulders hunched in defeat. Tommy's blood began to boil. "She's a person," he said, his voice rising, "just like anyone else." "Oh, really?" Mike stepped closer, his face inches from Tommy's. "Because where I come from, people like her are just a problem. You think you're gonna save her? You can't fix everything, dude." The words stung, but Tommy refused to let them control him. He looked Mike dead in the eyes, his voice steady, even though his heart raced. "I'm not trying to fix her. I'm just trying to be a decent human being." Mike scoffed, stepping back. "You'll regret this," he muttered under his breath before turning to his friends. "Come on, let's go." "This is pathetic." The group of teens snickered as they walked away, leaving Tommy standing there, staring after them. His pulse thudded in his ears, the adrenaline still rushing through him. But as he turned back to Maria, he saw the way her shoulders had slumped, the way she was staring at the ground as if she hadn't heard a word Tommy had said. Maria's silence cut deeper than anything the group had said. Tommy crouched down in front of her, gently lifting her chin with his fingers. Her eyes met his, but they were filled with a sadness that Tommy couldn't fix. "Don't listen to them," Tommy said softly. "You matter, Maria. You're not invisible." She shook her head, her lips trembling. "Why does it feel like I am, then?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why does it feel like I don't belong anywhere?" Tommy's heart twisted. He wanted to tell her that things would be okay, that they'd find a way out of this mess, but he didn't know how to say it. Instead, he simply pulled her into a gentle hug, holding her there, as if trying to convey everything he couldn't find the words for. And in that moment, Tommy realized that this wasn't about just saving Maria. It was about more than that. It was about standing up against the world that had let people like her slip through the cracks. It was about fighting for the dignity and humanity of people who were forgotten. It was about the fight for change, for justice, no matter how hard it seemed. Tommy's resolve deepened. He wasn't going to stop now. He couldn't. The days following the confrontation with Mike and his friends left Tommy unsettled, but also more determined than ever. The world seemed to press against him from all sides. His father's disappointed looks, his friends' whispered comments, and the constant barrage of indifference from people on the streets. Yet, every time he saw Maria, sitting alone, weary yet dignified, something inside him told him that this battle was worth it. He wasn't just fighting for her. He was fighting for something bigger. Tommy knew that he couldn't fix everything, but he wasn't willing to give up on her. Every moment he spent with Maria made him feel more connected to her struggle, more aware of the injustices in the world that he had never noticed before. And though his efforts seemed small, every small victory gave him a sense of purpose. It was a cold morning when Tommy returned to the alleyway where Maria sat, her usual spot under the old brick wall. He found her in the same place she'd always been. Except today, there was something different about her. She didn't look up when Tommy approached, and her posture was slumped, as though the weight of the world had become too much to bear. For the first time, she didn't smile when she saw him. "Maria?" Tommy said, kneeling down beside her. He could feel the coldness of the morning seeping into his bones, but there was something colder in the air, something that hung between them, unspoken. Maria looked up slowly, and for a moment, Tommy thought he saw tears welling up in her eyes. "I can't do this anymore, Tommy," she said quietly, her voice heavy with the weight of despair. "It's too much. I don't know how to go on." Tommy's heart stopped. He had seen Maria struggle, had heard her talk about how difficult life was on the streets, but he had never seen her like this before. This wasn't just the fatigue of living without a home, without security. This was a deep, soul-crushing kind of exhaustion. Tommy felt a surge of panic. "Maria, don't say that," Tommy said urgently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone. I'm here. I promise you. I'm not going to leave you. We'll find a way to fix this." Maria shook her head slowly, her hands trembling as she pulled her knees to her chest. "I've been here for so long, Tommy. I don't know how to change it. People just keep walking by. No one cares. I don't even know if I care anymore." Her words were like a knife to Tommy's heart. He could see it in her eyes, the resignation, the sense of defeat that had settled over her like a heavy fog. She had given up. She no longer believed that anyone cared, least of all herself. Tommy felt a deep sense of helplessness wash over him, but he refused to let it consume him. He couldn't afford to let Maria feel this way. He had to find a way to make her believe again, to give her hope. "You're wrong," Tommy said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I care. I'm not going to walk away. And you're not invisible. I won't let you be." Maria looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and disbelief. "You can't fix me, Tommy. No one can." Tommy took a deep breath, steeling himself. He wasn't going to back down. He had seen how people treated her, how they ignored her, avoided her, as if she didn't matter. But he knew better now. She mattered. She mattered to him, and she mattered in this world. "I don't need to fix you, Maria," Tommy said softly. "You're not broken. You're just stuck. And I won't let you stay stuck. You're not alone in this. I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment, Maria didn't say anything. She just looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as though trying to decide if he really meant what he said. Finally, she spoke again, her voice trembling with a quiet vulnerability. "What if I don't know how to keep going? What if I don't have it in me anymore?" Tommy's heart ached for her, but he didn't let it show. "You don't have to know how to keep going. Not yet. All you need to do is take one step. I'm here with you, every step of the way." Maria's gaze softened, just a little. She looked down at the ground, as if contemplating his words. The silence stretched between them, but for the first time in days, Tommy felt like there was a glimmer of hope, something small but real, like a candle flickering in the dark. As they sat together in silence, a soft breeze stirred the air, and Tommy felt a surge of determination fill him. He wasn't just fighting for Maria. He was fighting for every person who had ever been ignored, dismissed, or discarded. He wasn't going to let this world break her, not if he could help it. He stood up, offering his hand to Maria. "Come on, let's go find somewhere warm. We'll figure out the next step together." Maria hesitated for a moment, then slowly reached out, her hand trembling as it met his. She stood up, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Tommy saw a faint flicker of hope in her eyes. The next few days were a blur. Tommy spent every free moment trying to find a solution for Maria. He contacted shelters, social services, anyone who might be able to help. But every door he knocked on seemed to close in his face. The shelters were full, the resources stretched thin. He was starting to feel the weight of the world pressing down on him again. His father's constant disapproval, his friends' dismissive comments, and the overwhelming frustration of trying to make a difference in a system that felt broken. But despite all of this, Tommy refused to give up. Maria needed him, and he needed her too. The connection they had forged was stronger than any setback, any rejection. He kept trying, kept pushing forward, even when it felt like the world was telling him to stop. One afternoon, after hours of fruitless searching, Tommy sat down on a bench in the park, exhausted. He had reached out to every resource he could think of, but none of them seemed to be able to help. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling up inside him. He couldn't do this alone. He had to find a way to make people listen, to make them care. And then, just as he was about to give in to the overwhelming sense of defeat, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Tommy." He turned to see Maria standing a few feet away, her face a mixture of concern and determination. She wasn't looking at the ground this time. She wasn't defeated. She was standing tall, as though something inside her had shifted. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice steady. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to change everything, but maybe I can start with myself." Tommy stood up, feeling a rush of emotion at her words. This wasn't the girl who had been so lost just days ago. This was a woman who was ready to fight. "You're ready?" Tommy asked, his voice filled with awe. Maria nodded. "I don't know how yet, but I want to try. I don't want to be invisible anymore." Tommy's heart swelled with pride. This wasn't the end of the story. This was just the beginning. And in that moment, Tommy knew that they were in this together. The road ahead would be long, but as long as they kept fighting, they would never be alone. The days grew colder, and as winter began to settle over the city, Tommy found himself at a crossroads. He had become accustomed to the weight of his decisions, the moments when he felt unsure, and yet, he never faltered in his resolve. He had promised Maria that he wouldn't abandon her, and every day he fought to honor that promise, even as the world seemed to push back harder. After Maria had expressed her desire to start fighting for herself, Tommy did everything in his power to help. They had both made small strides. Maria was slowly regaining her sense of agency, and Tommy was finding ways to get her the support she needed. However, the deeper Tommy dug into the system, the more obstacles he encountered. It wasn't just about helping one person anymore. It was about exposing a system so entrenched in indifference and prejudice that it seemed insurmountable. One cold morning, as Tommy met Maria on the corner where she often waited, he noticed something unusual. She wasn't alone. There was a woman sitting beside her, an older lady with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression. Maria was talking to her in low tones, and when Tommy approached, both of their gazes turned toward him. "Tommy," Maria said, standing up quickly, "this is Mrs. Henderson. She's helping me." Her voice had a note of something new. Hope, perhaps? Tommy couldn't quite tell. Mrs. Henderson smiled wanly but firmly, her grip on her cane tightening slightly as she spoke. "I'm glad to meet you, Tommy. Maria's told me about you. You've been a good friend to her." Tommy was taken aback, but he extended his hand politely. "I'm glad to meet you too, Mrs. Henderson. I didn't realize Maria had someone helping her." Maria lowered her eyes, a slight blush creeping up her neck. "I've been looking for more help. And Mrs. Henderson, she's been through it all." Mrs. Henderson chuckled dryly, the sound carrying a mixture of strength and weariness. "I've been homeless too, kid. A long time ago. I got out, but I haven't forgotten what it's like. I'm not here to fix anyone, but if I can show them a way out, I will." Tommy nodded, a sense of relief flooding through him. I'll do whatever I can to help too. I'm just trying to find a way for Maria to stay safe, to have a place to go." Mrs. Henderson's sharp eyes softened. "You're a good kid, Tommy, but you need to understand something. This system? It's broken. What you're trying to do, it's not going to be easy." "I know," Tommy said, his voice quiet, "but I'm not going to stop. Maria deserves more than this." Mrs. Henderson studied him for a long moment. "Maybe," she said, her voice quieter now. "Maybe we all do. But sometimes, it's about getting people to listen. And sometimes, you have to push back harder than you ever thought possible." Tommy could feel the weight of her words sinking in. He had always thought he could fix things with just a few kind acts, but now, he realized that this fight for dignity and equality, was going to require far more than simple goodwill. It was going to take everything. The weeks that followed became a blur of meetings, calls, and plans. Tommy's determination grew, but so did his frustrations. Each door he knocked on led to another dead end. Shelters were full, and the government resources seemed stretched beyond capacity. But Tommy wasn't the kind to give up easily. He'd seen Maria's strength begin to return, and it gave him the fuel he needed to keep going. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Tommy met Maria and Mrs. Henderson at the park, a small, quiet spot by the lake. The air was crisp, and the trees seemed to whisper in the wind. Tommy was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but when he saw the two of them waiting for him, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Maria stood up as Tommy approached, a new glint of determination in her eyes. "I talked to someone today," she said, her voice steady. "A woman at one of the shelters. She said they might be able to help me get into a program, but it's going to take time. A long time." Tommy's heart soared. "That's amazing, Maria. This is the first step. You've got this." But Maria hesitated, her face clouded with doubt. "It might take too long. And what if they turn me away again? I don't know if I can keep going if nothing changes soon." Mrs. Henderson placed a hand on her shoulder, giving her a firm yet comforting squeeze. "That's the thing, Maria," she said, her voice a steady anchor. "It's not just about waiting for things to change. Sometimes, you have to make them change." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Henderson looked around, ensuring no one was listening, then leaned in a little closer. "I've been thinking about this a lot, Tommy. I've seen too many people like Maria come and go, too many who get stuck in a system that never works. But what if we could change it? What if we could force them to listen, make them see what we're up against?" Tommy frowned, not sure where she was going with this. "Force them? No." Mrs. Henderson gave him a knowing look. "It's about more than just asking for help, Tommy. It's about creating a movement. People need to know what's happening out here. They need to see the truth, the reality of what it means to be homeless, to be marginalized. And the only way to make them see is to make some noise." Tommy's mind raced. He had never thought about it this way. He had always tried to work within the system, trying to find the right path through all the bureaucracy and red tape. But what if the system wasn't built to work for people like Maria? What if it was built to keep people like her down? "So, what are you saying?" Tommy asked, his voice cautious. "I'm saying," Mrs. Henderson said, her eyes burning with conviction, "that it's time to take a stand. We're not just going to wait around for someone to save us. We're going to make them listen. We're going to get this story out there. And when enough people hear it, when they see how broken this system is, they'll have no choice but to act." Tommy stood still, processing her words. The enormity of it hit him all at once. This wasn't just about helping Maria anymore. It was about exposing the injustice of the world around them. It was about giving people like Maria a voice and forcing society to hear it. "I'm in," Tommy said, his voice steady with a new sense of purpose. Maria looked at him, uncertainty still in her eyes. But there was a flicker of something else. Hope. "Are you sure? It could get dangerous. People might not want to hear what we have to say." Tommy nodded, his resolve firm. "I don't care anymore. I'm not going to let people like you stay invisible. It's time for all of us to be heard." As the wind picked up around them, the three of them stood together by the lake, a quiet promise passing between them. They didn't know what would come next, or how long it would take, but one thing was clear. They were ready to fight. and the fight they were about to wage would change everything. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity, each day more intense than the last. Tommy, Maria, and Mrs. Henderson had made a decision. A decision to do more than just wait for the world to change around them. They were going to make noise. They were going to expose the truth. They were going to show the world exactly what it was like to be overlooked, ignored, and forgotten. It all began with a simple idea that Mrs. Henderson had pitched one night as they sat in the park, watching the city skyline fade into the darkness. It was time to tell their stories. Not just their personal stories, but the stories of everyone they knew who had suffered because of a broken system. And not just through words, but through action. Through a public demonstration, a march, a gathering. They needed to be visible. They needed to be loud. Tommy had never been involved in anything like this before. He had always been the quiet one, the kid who tried to avoid drama, who followed the rules. But something inside him had changed. He had seen the harsh realities of life on the streets. He had seen how people like Maria were treated, not just as invisible, but as less than human. He couldn't keep standing by. Not anymore. "I don't know where to start," Tommy said, looking at Mrs. Henderson and Maria, his hands restless in his lap. "This isn't something we can just do on a whim, right? We'll need permits. We'll need to plan everything. People aren't going to just listen." Maria, who had slowly started to regain some confidence over the past few weeks, looked up at Tommy. "They didn't listen the first time, Tommy, but we're not asking anymore. We're telling them. We're showing them." Mrs. Henderson nodded. "Exactly. It's not enough to just talk. We have to make them see us. And if we have to get loud to do it, then that's what we'll do." Tommy felt a chill run through him. The fear of the unknown, of stepping into territory he didn't know how to navigate, crept up his spine. But Maria's words, Mrs. Henderson's unshakable confidence, made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Together, they started making their plans. The march was set for 3 weeks from that day, a cold Saturday morning. Tommy had worked tirelessly to get everything together, to connect with local community groups, activists, and media outlets. Mrs. Henderson had used her network of contacts from her own experience in the homeless community, and Maria had slowly started speaking with others who had lived on the streets, people who had the same fears, the same hopes. They weren't just planning a protest, they were starting a movement. As the day of the march approached, Tommy felt a knot tighten in his chest. His family still didn't understand. He had tried to explain, tried to tell them about the plan, about why it was so important to him. But his father, especially, seemed even more distant than before. He had called Tommy's actions reckless, naive. He didn't understand why his son would throw away everything for a cause that didn't seem to affect him directly. "You're going to get yourself into trouble, Tommy," his father had warned one night, his voice heavy with concern. "People like her. They'll never change. Why put yourself in danger?" Tommy had tried to argue, but the words didn't come out the way he wanted. In the end, it was easier to say nothing at all. He just couldn't bear the thought of abandoning Maria now. He couldn't let his fear of what might happen stop him from doing what he knew was right. The morning of the march arrived, colder than expected, the wind biting at their faces as they stood in the crowded park, waiting for the gathering to begin. Tommy was surprised to see just how many people had shown up. Hundreds, maybe even thousands. People of all ages, backgrounds, and stories were there. Some held signs that read, "No one should live like this, homeless lives matter," and "We see you." Others just stood silently, their faces full of determination. Maria was standing beside him, her hand trembling slightly in his. Tommy could see the fear in her eyes, but also something else, a quiet strength. She wasn't just doing this for herself anymore. She was doing it for every person who had been left behind. "Are you ready for this?" Tommy asked softly, his voice filled with anticipation and concern. Maria smiled faintly. "I don't know if I'm ready, but I have to do it. I'm tired of feeling like I don't matter. Today, we all matter." Mrs. Henderson, standing a few feet away, looked over at them. Her face was stoic, but there was a fire in her eyes. "We've waited long enough, kid. It's time to show them who we are." And with that, the crowd began to move. The march was slow but deliberate. As they moved through the streets, more people joined in. creating a sea of faces that stretched as far as Tommy could see. Every step they took was a statement. Every word spoken a declaration that they would not be ignored. The noise of the crowd swelled with chants. Chants of anger, of shame, of defiance. Tommy could feel the tension in the air. A buzzing electricity as they neared the center of the city, where the local government building stood. That was their destination. They had to make it to the steps of the building, where the media would be waiting. The eyes of the city would be on them. Tommy could already hear the reporters shouting questions as they approached. Maria gripped Tommy's hand tighter as they neared the steps. "Do you think they'll listen?" she asked, her voice tight with nerves. Tommy didn't have an answer, but as they stood on the steps, the crowd behind them growing larger, he felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a march. This was a call to arms. This was the beginning of something that would change everything. And then, as they reached the microphone, Tommy found his voice. It wasn't much, just a few words at first, but as he spoke, the weight of everything he had learned, everything he had experienced, seemed pouring out. "They've told us we don't matter," Tommy said, his voice steady but filled with raw emotion. "They've told us we're invisible, that we're nothing, but we are here today to show them the truth. We are here to show them that we matter. All of us." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the streets. Tommy looked over at Maria, who was smiling through tears, and Mrs. Henderson, who stood beside them, proud and resolute. But just as the cheering reached a crescendo, a voice shouted from the crowd, a voice filled with anger and hate. "You don't belong here. Go back to where you came from." The voice was followed by others, and Tommy's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment he had feared, the backlash. But he stood tall, looking out over the crowd, refusing to let the hate drown out the truth. Maria stepped forward, her eyes blazing with resolve. "We belong here," she shouted back, her voice carrying across the crowd. "This is our city too, and we're not leaving until you see us." In that moment, Tommy realized something. The fight wasn't just about the march, the protest, or the people who opposed them. It was about the power of their voices, the strength of their unity, and the undeniable truth that they couldn't be silenced. And they wouldn't stop fighting. Not now, not ever. That night, the city was abuzz with news of the protest. News outlets covered the march extensively, some with a tone of sympathy, others with blatant disdain. But it didn't matter. The message had been heard. The voices of the invisible had been given the chance to be seen. And for Tommy, Maria, and Mrs. Henderson, that was just the beginning. As Tommy lay in bed that night, the weight of the day finally sinking in, he smiled to himself. They had made a difference. They had begun to change the world. And no matter what came next, he knew they were ready to face it together. The following weeks after the march felt like a blur to Tommy. The media had covered the protest from every angle, some with sympathy, others with criticism. But despite the mixed reactions, the world had changed in subtle, undeniable ways. People had seen them. They had heard their stories. Tommy could feel it in the air, the change that had begun to ripple through the city. At first, the response was fragmented. Some praised the courage of the protesters, while others, especially in the upper echelons of city politics, dismissed them as a temporary disruption. But there was one undeniable fact that no one could ignore. The homeless issue was now front and center, and there were people demanding change. Tommy, Maria, and Mrs. Henderson were busy with interviews, meetings with activists, and discussions with city officials. There were promises of reforms, small steps at least. Shelters were being made available to more people, and certain housing initiatives were finally seeing funding. But Tommy knew that these were just the beginning. This was not a one-time fix. The system had to change. The people who had suffered for so long needed more than temporary solutions. They needed real, sustainable change. It was late one afternoon when Tommy got a call from Maria. He had been busy putting together another petition for more shelter space when his phone rang. The tightness in his chest returned as he recognized her number. "Tommy, you need to come over. I don't know what to do." Maria's voice was strained, shaky. The panic in her voice sent a chill down Tommy's spine. "Maria, what's wrong? Where are you?" "I'm at the corner by the old bookstore. You need to come quickly." Without another word, Tommy grabbed his jacket and rushed out of the house. His mind raced, the possibilities of what could be wrong flooding him with dread. Had something happened to Maria? Was she in danger? When Tommy arrived at the corner, he saw her standing there, leaning against a lamppost. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She was shaking, her hands pressed tightly against her sides. "Maria!" Tommy ran up to her, his voice full of concern. "What happened? Are you okay?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked past him, her gaze fixed on something, or someone, out of sight. Tommy followed her gaze, but there was nothing there. Finally, Maria spoke, her voice trembling. I saw someone today. Someone I used to know. Someone from my old life." She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "He came up to me, and he started yelling at me. Told me that I didn't belong here, that I'd never get out of this life, that I was just a waste of space." Tommy felt a sickening knot form in his stomach. He stepped closer, trying to offer some comfort. "What happened? Did he hurt you?" "No," Maria said quickly, shaking her head. "No, but he scared me. He said things, Tommy, things that hit too close to home. And I think he was right. I'm not sure I can really change. I've been stuck in this life for so long, I don't know how to get out anymore." Tommy's heart ached for her. He could see the darkness in her eyes, the doubt creeping in, the fear that maybe everything they had fought for, the march, the promises, was just too much. Maybe they were all just stuck in a cycle too deep to escape. "Maria," Tommy said softly, taking her hand. "You are not stuck. You've already taken so many steps. You've gotten this far. Just because someone tries to drag you back doesn't mean you have to go." Maria's eyes filled with tears. "But what if I can't do it? What if all of this hope, this fight, it's just a dream that's never going to come true?" Tommy pulled her into a tight hug, not knowing what else to say. He wished he could take away her fear, for pain, but he knew that only time and patience would heal her. "You've made it this far, and I'm not going to let you go. You're not alone in this, okay?" Maria nodded against him, though she still felt broken inside. Tommy wasn't sure how long they stood there, just holding each other. But when she pulled away, her face had softened slightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't think I could do this without you." Tommy smiled, though there was an ache in his chest. "You can. You will. And I'll be with you every step of the way." The next few days were filled with difficult conversations. Maria was struggling to believe in the possibility of a better future, and Tommy could feel the weight of her despair dragging on him. But he couldn't let her fall. He wouldn't let her. That was when Mrs. Henderson suggested something new. "It's time for us to go bigger," she said, her voice stern and filled with purpose. "We've made waves, but now we need to push harder. We've started something, Tommy. We've shown the world we're here. Now it's time to show them we won't back down." "What do you mean?" Tommy asked, looking at her in confusion. "We're going to hold a rally in the heart of the city. We're going to take this fight to the people who've ignored us for too long. City leaders, law enforcement, the media. They need to know that this isn't going away." Tommy's heart raced. This wasn't just another protest. This was the next level. They were going to force everyone to listen. The tension in his body was palpable. He was both excited and terrified, unsure of the outcome. What if they won't listen? What if it just turns into another fight? Tommy's voice was laced with doubt. He had seen how the world had resisted change, how powerful people never seemed to care. Mrs. Henderson looked at him, her expression firm but understanding. "Then we fight harder, Tommy, but we don't stop." The weeks leading up to the rally were filled with planning, organizing, and more discussions with Maria and Mrs. Henderson. Tommy found himself working with local activists, coordinating logistics, and gathering support. It was exhausting, but he knew it was worth it. He could see the determination in Maria's eyes, the fire that had reignited after their conversation at the corner. She was no longer the girl who had doubted herself. She was a force of nature, ready to make herself heard. The day of the rally arrived with a biting wind that swept through the streets. Tommy and Maria stood at the front of the crowd, side by side, as the first speakers took the stage. People from all walks of life, homeless, activists, ordinary citizens, stood in solidarity, their voices united. The city was about to feel the force of their collective anger, their collective demand for change. As the rally began, Tommy could feel the tension building. This was more than just a demonstration. This was their declaration that they would no longer accept being invisible. This was the moment when they would no longer be silenced. Maria took the microphone next, her voice strong and steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. We are not just a problem to be fixed. We are human beings. We have lives, we have stories, and we deserve to be seen. You can't ignore us any longer. The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising in unison, filling the streets. Tommy stood there, watching Maria speak with such courage, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a deep sense of pride. The rally was just the beginning. Tommy knew that they had a long road ahead of them, but as he looked around at the faces of those who had joined in, he felt the weight of the world begin to lift. The fight wasn't over, but it was far from hopeless, and together, they would change everything. The aftermath of the rally was both overwhelming and inspiring. The streets had echoed with voices, angry, hopeful, determined, and the response was immediate. The media coverage exploded. Reporters flooded the area, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward Tommy, Maria, and Mrs. Henderson as they shared their message with the world. People who had been silent for years, who had lived in the shadows, now had their voices amplified. The world had seen them, and now there was no turning back. The first few days after the rally were a whirlwind of meetings, press interviews, and gatherings with local organizations. Politicians started to show up at community centers, making promises about tackling homelessness, creating more shelter spaces, and ensuring that people in Maria's situation wouldn't be ignored anymore. But Tommy couldn't help but feel uneasy. These were just words. Words he had heard before, empty promises that had never been followed through. This time, they couldn't afford to stop pushing. This time, the fight had to keep moving forward. As the days passed, Tommy found himself more exhausted than he had ever been. He'd been going to school, organizing meetings, running from one appointment to the next. Maria was struggling too. She had gotten a place in a temporary shelter, but her fear of being turned away again never really went away. She still saw herself as someone who didn't belong, who had been abandoned by the world. Tommy could see it in her eyes, that deep-rooted fear of rejection. But she was fighting it, fighting to believe that things could get better. One evening, Tommy sat down at the kitchen table, his mind racing with thoughts of what they had accomplished and what still needed to be done. His father had barely spoken to him in the last few weeks, his silence a constant reminder of how different their worlds had become. Tommy's mother, however, had begun to soften. She had heard the stories on the news, seen the faces of people like Maria, and she'd started to understand why Tommy had been so determined. But his father remained cold, distant, and unwilling to listen. Tommy picked up his phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing Maria's number. She had promised to meet him that evening to discuss the next step in their plans. They had grown close over the past few weeks, united by a shared sense of purpose and a mutual understanding of the struggles they both faced. When she answered, her voice sounded softer than usual. "Hey, Tommy, how's everything?" "Busy," Tommy said, forcing a smile. "We've got a lot to sort out, don't we? But I was thinking about something." "What's that?" "I think it's time we take this to the next level," Tommy said, his voice growing more certain. "We've done the marches, we've gotten the attention, but now we need to push for something concrete, something that can't be ignored." Maria fell silent for a moment. Tommy could tell she was deep in thought. "You're right," she said finally. "We need something that shows the system can actually work for people like me. But what do we do next?" Tommy paused. "I'm going to call a meeting with the city council. We've gotten their attention. We need to demand that they stop talking and start acting. We need them to allocate funding, real funding, for housing programs that work. Not temporary solutions, but real, lasting change." Maria's voice held a note of hesitation. "But what if they don't listen? What if they brush us off again?" "They can't," Tommy said, his voice growing stronger. "Not after what we've done. Not after what we've shown them. We've made the world see us. And now we're going to make them do something about it. The next few days were filled with intense preparation. Tommy reached out to local community leaders, organizations, and activists who had been working on homelessness for years. They gathered in a small, cramped office at the community center. Maps of the city sprawled across the table, charts and statistics about the growing homeless population pinned to the walls. Mrs. Henderson, as usual, took charge, her no-nonsense attitude rallying the group. "We need a plan," she said, slamming her hand down on the table. "A solid, undeniable plan. We can't just go in there and ask for help. We need to make it clear that we're not going away. We need to tell them what we need and demand action." Tommy, Maria, and the others took notes as Mrs. Henderson laid out the strategy. They would meet with city council members, ask for a seat at the table, and demand a full review of current policies. But more than that, they would present solutions, detailed plans on how to use existing resources more effectively, how to secure funding for long-term housing projects, and how to create programs that would help people like Maria get back on their feet. It wasn't enough to just talk about the problem. They had to present a solution. The day of the meeting arrived. Tommy dressed in his best clothes, a crisp shirt and slacks. But despite his outward appearance, his nerves were eating away at him. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on his shoulders. This wasn't just a meeting. It was the moment when they would either be heard or ignored, when they would either make progress or be sent back to the streets. Maria, as usual, was quieter than he expected. She had come a long way since their first encounter. But now, standing outside the city hall, she looked smaller again, like the weight of everything was too much to carry. "You okay?" Tommy asked, his voice gentle as they stood on the steps. Maria nodded, though her eyes were filled with uncertainty. "I don't know if they'll listen, Tommy. What if they just tell us to go away?" "They won't," Tommy said firmly. "We fought too hard for this. We've worked too hard to be ignored now. They'll listen. I promise." Inside, the council chambers were filled with tension. Politicians, reporters, and community leaders filled the room. But Tommy's focus was on the seats where the council members would sit. This wasn't just another public hearing. It was the beginning of something much bigger. They had gathered evidence, they had gathered support, and they had one goal: to make the city officials see the reality of homelessness. Not as an abstract issue, but as a human one. The meeting began with the usual formalities, but as soon as the council members began to speak, Tommy felt his chest tighten. This was it. This was the moment they had been working for. He stood up, his heart racing, and when the time came for him to speak, he walked to the podium. "My name is Tommy," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "And I'm here today to tell you that we are not going away. We've fought for years to be heard. But now, we're here to demand that you do something. We are not asking for charity. We are not asking for handouts. We are asking for the dignity and respect that every human being deserves. People like Maria, people like the thousands of others living on the streets, they deserve homes. They deserve the opportunity to rebuild their lives. And we are here to make sure that you act on that." Tommy paused, looking around the room at the sea of faces, some skeptical, some intrigued, some with the faintest hint of guilt in their eyes. "You have the power to make change. You have the power to stop ignoring us. You have the power to create something better for all of us. We are asking you today, as citizens, as human beings, to take responsibility and make this city one where everyone belongs." There was a long silence in the room. For a moment, Tommy feared they had said nothing at all. But then, one council member stood up. "We hear you, Tommy," the council member said, her voice steady. "And we're listening." Tommy's heart raced as he sat back down. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time, he felt a shift. Something had changed. He had said the words that needed to be said, and now they had no choice but to act. For the first time in a long while, Tommy believed that real change was possible. But they weren't done yet. Not by a long shot. As the echoes of Tommy's words hung in the air, a sense of possibility began to spread. The city had heard them. But it wasn't just the council chambers or the media that needed to hear. It was every person who had ever walked by a homeless person without a second thought. Every individual who had turned away from a problem too big to face alone. Now, It was up to everyone to act, to stand up, to speak out, and to ensure that the promise of change didn't fade away into the shadows. The journey ahead would not be easy. There would be setbacks, obstacles, and moments when hope seemed distant. But every step, no matter how small, brought them closer to the world they dreamed of. A world where no one would be invisible, where everyone would be seen, heard, and valued.